Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the Fast Friday edition of the show for June 16th, 2023. This episode today, I'm talking about applying James Madison's strategy to stop federal programs and putting it into direct effect against the new pistol brace rule without relying on the feds to somehow magically stop themselves, which never seems to happen. And what we're talking about is what he told us to do to enforce the Constitution in Federalist number 46. Here he gave us this big picture blueprint, 4 steps of how to stop the feds, again, without relying on the feds to magically limit their own power. Here, for example, he tells us it's going to be very effective as well. Using this strategy would oppose in any state, a single state, difficulties not to be despised. It would form in a large state very serious impediments. And where the sentiments of several adjoining states happen to be in unison, would present obstructions which the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. So if you want to stop federal programs, this is how you do it. A single state would make it difficult for the feds. A large state would make it very difficult. And a bunch of states following this strategy, well, the states and the people are going to win. And here's how he put it. Should an unwarrantable measure of the federal government be unpopular in particular states, which would seldom fail to be the case, or even a warrantable measure be so, which would sometimes be the case, the means of opposition to it are powerful and at hand. And in other words, this is the strategy to stop federal programs, whether you first of all think the act is unconstitutional, or as Madison put it, unwarrantable, they're not authorized to do it, or if it's constitutional but bad policy. We don't even have to debate constitutionality on this. We don't have to wait for courts. We don't have to have any determination of whether or not the federal act is in the bounds of the Constitution. They aren't in any ways, especially the pistol brace rule, but we can just set that aside and say, well, you can call it whatever you want. We're going to follow Madison's strategy to deal with this, whether it's warrantable or unwarrantable. And step 1, he said, is the disquietude of the people. James Madison, here from an article I wrote on this a few years ago, Madison expected that the people would throw a fit when the feds usurped power or tried to implement unpopular policies. And that leads to the next step. And when it comes to this pistol brace rule, I think this is pretty straightforward. People need to be really outspoken opposing it, both online and off, and we are seeing an increasing amount of that. We just need to keep seeing it ramp up and up and up. So number 1, the people have to be very vocal about what's going on. Number 2, their repugnance and perhaps refusal to cooperate with officers of the union. Now, if you're like me, you think the whole situation, the gun grabbers, they're totally repugnant, they're gross, they're disgusting, and that's true, but Madison wasn't using the word repugnance in the same way. The number one dictionary, back to the article, the number one dictionary of the time defined repugnance as, quote, disobedient, not obsequious, which is compliant. So if you want to stop the federal government, you have to disobey them. This comes from the father of the Constitution. He's the guy that, well, I think he's a pretty prominent dude. If you want to understand how to enforce the Constitution, go to James Madison. That's not a bad starting point. And he's telling us, first of all, the people have to be up in arms, throwing a fit, and then 2, non-compliance and a refusal to cooperate with officers of the union. You have to disobey them. Madison also suggested that the people would perhaps directly refuse to cooperate with federal agents. And we see this happening in a pretty big way already. Here from the Washington Examiner, and I think this was just published, well, just yesterday. According to ATF spokesman Eric Longnecker, quote, as of June 1st, 2023, ATF received 255,162 applications for tax-free registration. I'm not going to get into the details of the factoring criteria of this. If you know, you know. And so basically what we're talking about is 255,000 people, about 250,000 applications for the tax-free registration during this grace period that they so kindly bestowed upon us. Here from over at The Reload, which has got a lot of interesting stuff on the site, they put it this way: that number represents just a fraction of the braced guns believed to have been sold in the decades since the ATF first classified a version as outside the scope of the National Firearms Act. And I think that therein lies the problem, partly. As long as you allow the National Firearms Act to continue in force, as long as people aren't using Madison's strategy, four-step strategy, against the entirety of all federal gun control, because none of it should exist, we shouldn't be surprised when the executive branch over time tries to reclassify stuff in the future to somehow fit into something that was passed in 1934. All of a sudden, this gets redefined and it becomes something else so they can control, regulate, prohibit, basically do more gun control. So it's just a fraction. In the impact assessment for the rule, they write, the ATF estimated that 3 to 7 million of these devices exist in the way that they want to regulate and control. Now, the Congressional Research Service puts the number much higher at somewhere between 10 and 40 million. I believe the statistics are there are about 10 to 40 million in circulation or that have been purchased and owned by people, and somewhere between 3 and 7 million they basically want to get rid of. That's a pretty significant amount. And whatever the number is, we're talking about 250,000, which is way 250,000 too many, versus millions and millions. And they put it this way, that puts the registration rate for pistol brace equipped guns at between 0.6% and 8% at most. Now, keep in mind, this is a start, but this is exactly what needs to be done. Disobedience and a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union, but it's not the end of the story, and people do need to hold the line. Here's more from the Reload. They say that Longnecker noted that owners of the affected guns could also comply with the rule by either dismantling the firearms and destroying the braces or turning them over to the ATF. He said the agency does not know how many Americans have taken those routes. Quote, ATF is unable to estimate the number of possessors of such firearms that used either of these methods to comply with the final rule. Likewise, we have no data currently available for the number of firearms abandoned to ATF. I hope it's zero. I don't think anyone should be turning them in like that, but who knows? Let's say it's another 250,000. Still, the numbers are very, very low in comparison to the millions of these devices in circulation. So that's number 2, a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. Number 3 is the frowns of the executive magistracy of the state. And here, from my article, Madison envisions governors formally protesting federal actions. Governors can't pass law, but they can bring a lot of awareness to the situation. This not only raises public awareness, executive leadership will also lead to the next step, which is legislative action. That's number 4. Madison said legislative devices, which would often be added on such occasions. This is on the state level or in some situations on a local level. And we're already seeing this part happen in a number of states. And I've got an example that kind of combines both the frowns of the executive magistracy and number 4, which is legislative devices, which clearly go hand in hand from time to time. Here's a tweet from the governor of Montana from February. Our right to keep and bear arms is integral to Montana's and our nation's rich heritage. That's why we prohibited the enforcement of federal gun bans in Montana, like the ATF's pistol brace rule. So he sent out a letter to Merrick Garland, and it says this: as a matter of law, and I will link to this in the show notes, all the stuff that I'm citing here, articles, other episodes. I don't think I have another I do have another one coming up here. These tweets, this letter that was sent to Merrick Garland. I will link to that in the show notes. In the next couple hours, I'll publish a blog post for this episode over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Anyways, here's the letter from the governor to Garland. As a matter of law, the state of Montana and its political subdivisions cannot enforce or assist the ATF with enforcement of this rule. The 2021 Montana legislature passed, and I signed into law, House Bill 258, which bans them from participating in this. And I covered this in some detail in an episode just after it happened. So February 15th, 2023, Montana versus the ATF, no enforcement of pistol brace rule. I will link to that in the show notes. If you haven't checked it out yet, I encourage you to do so. There I talk primarily about Montana, but of course, Missouri has also banned participation in the enforcement of this, Arizona, and in some ways, I think Idaho, but it really remains to be seen how they implement it. Now, where this is already out of date is just a few weeks after I did that episode. Kentucky passed a law that was based on the Montana one, so now there are at least 4. We can also count Idaho. Let's think positively here and say there are 5 states that are banned from participating in enforcement. I will link to an article covering a report by Mike Meharry covering the Kentucky law, which was passed very easily through the legislature. And the governor, who probably didn't like it there, let it become law without a signature. I was surprised to see that, maybe because it's pretty easy to override. Anyways, back to Madison. I don't know if the good guys are going to win in the short run on this. But when it comes to stopping this pistol brace rule, James Madison's steps, his strategy are all in motion right now. The people are up in arms, pun intended. We see disquietude, repugnance, their disobedience, their refusal to cooperate with officers of the union by people and even by state legislation. The governors some of them are speaking up about this and bringing more attention. And we've got 4 states officially banning, 4.5, maybe 5 states officially banning resources to participate in the enforcement of this ATF rule. We need to see that up to like 15, 20, maybe 30. I'd love to see all 50, but that's certainly not going to happen in places like here in California. So we really do need to see a lot more of this to have a chance to actually nullify it in practice, in effect. And where push comes to shove, I think more important than anything. I know a lot of people have not turned them in. And I think a lot of people will continue to do that. But where it really, the line in the sand is drawn is when the federal government refuses to do the right thing. If Congress does not stop this, if the executive branch continues to try to enforce, and if even the Supreme Court takes the wrong side on this, the people still have to hold the line, because ultimately, as Thomas Jefferson told us, a free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as a gift of their chief magistrate. So ultimately, it's up to the people to exercise their rights, whether the government happens to like it or not. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. I hope there's a little silver lining. There's so much coming at us from all directions in recent years, well, for all our lives, really. But it seems to be ramping up more and more and more. So to see something like this, I think, is incredibly positive. And I think this can encourage people to do more of the same on this issue and expand it to others, provided we get some success. The more success we have on this pistol brace rule, the more success we'll have, I think, on other issues as well, whether it's the right to keep and bear arms or other ways that the government is violating our natural rights day in and day out. Again, I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you learned something. I hope you have a great weekend. And I hope to see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.